So as usual, this is the big picture summary now at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, having done all the individual parts of the story. I say story, it's not really any story going on with that one, is it? Because it is in itself more of a summary of Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers. But it is a useful one that actually adds some details that are kind of missing from those, or at least I didn't spot them in the rest of that. So it certainly gives some prominence to some quite big ideas. So despite Deuteronomy being, I think it was basically repetition, it does stand alone as a useful part of what we've read so far. So as a quick recap on what we've done so far, we've had Genesis, which is basically people are by nature punks. Life is going to be pretty, not terrible, but there's going to be a lot of suffering, and necessarily so as a byproduct of consciousness and free will. We then have Exodus, which is basically God is the boss, and as the wise philosophers Bill and Ted once said, be excellent to each other. We then had Leviticus, which is boring and a big old bunch of rules, but basically seemed to me to be talking about how humans can manage a sinful nature. And then Numbers being broadly seems to me to be about what happens if we don't do as we're told. It's difficult to know how to characterise this one because my silly old brain was liking, Genesis equals X, Exodus equals Y, and they're all sort of contributing something. And then Deuteronomy sort of falls out of that format by being a summary of the last three. But then, as I said, it has highlighted some really big ideas. One of the key ones, I think, in that being about the whole genocide thing, because as soon as we left Numbers, it was feeling a little bit like, okay, there's a lot of go next door, kill all those people, wipe them out and take their stuff. And I didn't pick up from any of that, all the bits about what was actually happening and why that was a thing. And then that all comes out nicely in Deuteronomy. Basically, that it wasn't just the Israelites were going next door and killing their neighbours or anything. It's like the Canaanites as a whole being the people who were living in the land of Canaan before the Israelites got there. It's, those people, it's not okay to go setting fire to people as sacrifices to made up gods. And it doesn't particularly matter what you believe, I don't think. Normal people, you're going to agree that's correct, isn't it? That is not okay. So whether or not it's then okay to go and kill them all, but if you're God, it would seem fair enough, I suppose. I think that's something that atheists and people who believe in God could agree on, because I get that with this moral debate, there's a question mark over believers in God claim sort of ownership, as it were, of morality, in the sense if you haven't got a God, then you haven't got transcendent morality, therefore you only got relative morality. But I think even if you do accept that morality might be relative, you're still going to say that it's not okay to go setting fire to kids to sacrifice to made up gods. So, or at least if you are, you're not going to get invited over for dinner, are you? So that's going to be a rare sort of person. So I think no matter how you look at morality, either way, it's kind of settles that people are not just being killed just because. We see some more of this idea of God putting boundaries on things rather than seeking to absolutely control. Because one of the objections I keep hearing about God of the Old Testament is like, he's perfectly cool with slavery. It's like, okay, is he? And it's like, he does seem to be not supportive of it, but it certainly doesn't seem to be stopping it particularly, except there are limitations being put on it. Like you have to set your slave free after 7 years, and if you beat them and they lose a tooth, whatever it is, then you've got to let them go free. And yeah, don't get me wrong, it's a pretty low bar for, you can still have the slave, you can still smack them and you just don't knock the tooth out. But it does seem that feels like God is not trying to say you must do this, this, this and this, and more that, okay, you can do what you like, do what you think is best, but here's the boundaries of that. You can't go outside of this. We've got the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life thing as well. It's the same sort of idea, that not necessarily saying if someone knocks your tooth out, go and get them and knock their tooth out. It's not about vengeance. It seems to be more about just putting a limit on how far you can go with that. If returning to the parent metaphor, rightly or wrongly, it seems about correct that parents' jobs are to put boundaries on things and then to evolve those boundaries over time as a child gets older. You're not seeking to control everything they do, like now you must do this, now you must go do that, and all the rest of it. It's go play, be free, do as much as you, give them as much freedom as they can handle, and just put limits on how far that goes. And then as they get older, obviously the boundaries can expand, and that does seem to be what's happening on a societal level in this. And they've got to say slavery, 7 years max. It's now gone entirely in Christian societies, I think. I do, of course, acknowledge that there is a difference between, no, it's not okay to draw on daddy's seats in the car, and yeah, it's okay, fine, you can have a slave, but don't beat them up too much, and they're only going to slave for you for 7 years before you have to let them go. So in that respect, it's a poor example, but it's always going to be, isn't it? But the idea makes sense, I think. That feels like that's how that's going. And it seems like a good way to illustrate it, at least, if not to achieve much more than illustrating it, maybe. We see an example of that with Abraham, who was some 100 years before this, a few hundred, and he was married to his half-sister, which was okay then, apparently, at least no one seemed to object. At this point, that's no longer allowed, so those boundaries have actually contracted. So I guess that's the problem with the parent metaphor, whereas as the child gets older, the boundaries expand. As society develops, I guess the boundaries don't need to expand because the boundaries actually contract almost, but then there's less need to use them, I suppose. So it's a difficult metaphor, that one, isn't it? They've bitten off more than I can chew there. But either way, the root society is on changes, and then those boundaries need to shift with it. I suppose that could actually all just be a massive inconsistency. Abraham was married to his half-sister, and then 5 minutes later, God is saying, you can't marry your half-sister because that's not cool. And that could be argued as an inconsistency. And it's an inconsistency that is somewhat rectified by having a sort of a deeper reading between the lines of what's being said. So in terms of what's actually stated, you take it at face value, you get quite a different thing than if you try and pull out what it's getting at in between. And I do think you have to do that. If you read this stuff at face value, as you see, the likes of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, I read one of his recently as well, which I might do a tangent video on. It seems when it suits them to make a point, they do quite a very unsophisticated level of face value appraisal of something in the Bible. But I think the resulting argument is somewhat unsophisticated as well then. So it's not really one you need to take seriously, I don't think. I think either way, whether you believe the overall big picture or not, it would be a hard argument to make that you don't need to take some of the meaning from it from between the lines, as you might with any heavy piece of writing. But yeah, I would suggest at the very least, even if none of the actual theological stuff is true, then it's a profound masterpiece on human nature, at the very least. It's the whether it's true part that's really hard. I haven't figured that part out yet. But we're only 5 books in, aren't we? So anyway, that's the end of the Pentateuch, being the 5 books that are largely agreed to be mostly probably written by Moses, I think. It's not an easy read. I wonder if the tone's going to change now it's supposed to be a different author. And clearly it is something that needs to be really engaged with. And even, to be fair, at this level, reading a short section, making notes about it, then going and talk about it for 10 minutes, then editing all that. That's quite a reasonably deep level of engagement with it. And even with that, I'm acutely aware I'm barely scratching the surface of it. So there's a lot going on, clearly. But there is clearly a lot of metaphor in how people speak then. God literally talking about, I keep saying it, but, bringing people on the wings of eagles, which didn't happen. So people are saying things that didn't actually happen, but they're conveying ideas. So the detail is difficult. I think probably have to treat very carefully. But the big picture is certainly a bit I'm interested in anyway. I don't think what we've read so far could be taken as evidence for the existence of God, because it's just so... this could all be completely made up. My feeling was that Genesis was completely made up, but I don't think it matters, because I think what it conveys is deeply profound and useful. So it would make sense that someone written that, even though it wasn't true, literally true. So at this point, I don't think it matters that the first 5 books aren't going to offer any proof for the existence of God, or evidence for the existence of God, I should say. It does at least raise some very profound questions. There's some real line-up with actual human nature in terms of what's being written there. So some very deep truths. And it's very clever, at the very least. It's, if it wasn't steered, then some very, very smart people who were involved in coming up with it. I think one of the most surprising bits for me that comes out of reading the first 5 books is how it addresses some of the key arguments for atheism. I think I've mentioned before, one of the key objections I encounter when I ask people, why don't you believe in God? It's suffering. It keeps coming back to everyone talking about suffering. But even in Genesis, I think that made clear that suffering was going to be a thing, and why that would make sense in the context of having free will and consciousness. And it seems pretty simple, the idea that God's not going to want to steer us to a huge degree in the same way as you wouldn't to a child either, because that just wouldn't make any sense. Well, why would you bother creating something that you then controlled? That's a different thing to creating lives and enjoying those. And whether the actual stories are true or not, either way, it offers up a perfect explanation for why suffering would happen. And you scale that up, and what about bone cancer in children? And I'm not making light of any of it. But either way, in those first 200 pages of the Bible, there is at least not an explanation for why, but at least an outlining of a concept for if life was set up like this, that stuff would make sense, because if God did anything about it, then he'd muck up his own thing, in the same way that if you have a child and you dictate every single thing it does, you're not a good parent, are you? And it makes a difficult metaphor when the question is, okay, what if the child goes and pours boiling water over itself or something like that? I realise that's the level of problematic we've got, but on a spiritual scale, in terms of afterwards you might be talking an eternal life thereafter, which I appreciate we haven't encountered yet, then it feels like it's a perspective problem rather than an actual problem, which is a terrible thing to say, I realise, especially for someone who's in fortunate health and all the rest of it. But so we've got to explore the ideas no matter where they take us. But yeah, so that's it, and we're on to the book of Joshua next, which is presumably written by Joshua, so at least a much better naming strategy than the last couple of books.